Picture this, $200 billion. That is the jaw-dropping amount of wealth that was just wiped out, sending America spiraling into a literal decade of hunger and dust. Welcome to our explainer on the Great Depression. We're going to be looking at the boom, the bust, and the rebuild.
The sheer financial whiplash of this era, it was absolutely staggering. We're talking about people who literally woke up rich and went to bed broke. And the crazy thing is, there was no war that triggered this. There was no massive natural disaster acting as some big warning sign. It was just this terrifying, sudden crash that shifted the entire nation from unprecedented, roaring prosperity to absolute, catastrophic ruin. Overnight.
So what the hell actually happened? I mean, how does an entire economy just trip over its own shoelaces so spectacularly? To really understand this collapse, we kind of need to jump in the time machine and rewind to the massive party that happened just before the fall. Imagine waking up in 1922. The First World War is over, and the economy is, well, it's absolutely vibing. The sheer scale of the 1920s economic engine was dizzying. Factories completely pivoted. They stopped making tanks and started pumping out toasters, vacuum cleaners, and refrigerators. Just take the Model T, for example. Thanks to Henry Ford's moving assembly line, production time dropped from 12 hours to just 90 minutes. Cars flooded the streets, and that pulled oil, steel, and rubber right into this massive economic slipstream. Cities flourished with electricity, and America just fell in love with gadgets. By 1929, 10 million homes had radios, broadcasting jazz and optimism across the country. Everyone thought the good times were going to last forever. But while the urban centers were partying, some massive cracks were forming beneath the surface. Welcome to the era of buy now, pay later. This dangerous new practice of financing luxury consumer goods with installment plans became totally normal. Want a car? Finance it. Want a new radio? Finance it. And it wasn't just city folks. Struggling rural farmers who were actually dealing with plummeting crop prices at the time, they borrowed heavily to buy shiny new tractors, which, unfortunately, really just helped them go broke a little faster. Basically, both rural farmers and urbanites were masking deep economic cracks by buying things they simply couldn't afford on credit.
And all of this built into an even bigger catastrophe on Wall Street. The stock market basically became a Disneyland for adults, fueled by the margin loan trap. Here's how it worked. Step 1, you put just $10 down. Step 2, you borrow the remaining $90 from your broker. Boom, you now own $100 of stock. The logic was that stocks only go up, right? And between 1924 and 1929, the Dow Jones actually quadrupled. Fundamentals just went completely out the window. People bought holding companies that owned other holding companies that literally produced nothing. It became a giant casino where even shoeshine boys and barbers were giving stock tips to bankers. But as you can probably guess, step 3 was waiting in the wings. Lose it all when the market tanks.
Now, a few people did try to sound the alarm. Economist Roger Babson bluntly warned in 1929, a crash is coming. But Wall Street, they essentially responded by telling him to go touch grass. The jazz bands just played louder over his warnings. Dollar bills were practically raining from the sky. The market was entirely detached from reality, partying on a cliff's edge, and nobody was bothering to check if the floorboards could actually hold the weight of all this debt.
And then the music stopped. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. The day the stock market didn't just fall, it performed a flawless dive straight into concrete. The Dow absolutely plummeted. Ticker tape spit out red numbers non-stop. Traders were literally fainting on the floor of the exchange. Huge crowds gathered outside in stunned silence, some crying, just trying to comprehend that the roaring 20s had just face-planted into a brick wall.
$200 billion. Let's just take a second and let that breathe. Adjusted for inflation, that is the amount of wealth that simply vanished. And we're not talking about monopoly money here. These were real homes, real-life savings, college funds, hopes, and dreams. Those margin calls we talked about, they came due. Investors who had put down $10 for $100 of stock were suddenly asked for that other $90 immediately, and they had nothing to give. Entire paper fortunes evaporated overnight.
The panic quickly spread from Wall Street directly to Main Street. Inside the banks, you had tellers desperately trying to calm these surging crowds, shouting, "Your money is completely safe," but the vaults were empty. Banks had built their foundations on worthless paper and blind optimism. When the market imploded, banks couldn't get their loans back, so they collapsed. Families literally lost everything: grandpa's bonds,
worthless. And tragically, little Timmy's piggy bank was suddenly the only remaining asset in the entire household.
And, this disaster didn't stop at the American border. Panicking U.S. banks rapidly called in their overseas loans. This threw European economies, which, remember, were still fragile and duct-taped together after World War I, into an absolute blender. Global trade, the great artery of prosperity, choked and plummeted by 50% in just 3 years. Half of the world's trade just gone.
This grim downward spiral cascaded so rapidly. 1929 was just the initial crash. By 1930, we started seeing cascading bank failures. By 1931, the lights were literally turning off across industrial America. Detroit watched its auto plants shudder as production collapsed by an astonishing 75%. The great machines just stopped turning. The economy staggered forward, broken, completely clueless, and pretending everything would eventually just fix itself.
Which brings us to a really devastating human reality: 25% unemployment. 1 in every 4 Americans who wanted to work couldn't. Fathers were whispering apologies to their families. Endless, quiet breadlines snaked through downtowns where mothers lined up at dawn just for some thin soup. Teachers across the country were reporting students literally fainting in class, and not from boredom, but from starvation. America was starving.
And right when it seemed like it couldn't possibly get any worse, the sky itself turned black. Out in the Great Plains, years of overly aggressive farming had stripped the land totally bare. So when a massive drought hit, the soil just cracked. And then came the winds. They called them the black blizzards. These were towering biblical dust storms that blotted out the sun, burying crops, suffocating livestock, and filling homes with dirt. Millions of Americans were forced to flee their buried lives, packing up whatever they could into broken-down cars and heading to California, desperately chasing rumors of work.
The nation was absolutely at its breaking point. Now, President Herbert Hoover believed in volunteerism and heavily resisted large-scale federal aid. He viewed it as dangerous to the American system. But as a result of the crisis completely outstripping local charity, desperate citizens ended up living in scrap shanty towns they ironically named Hoovervilles. They slept under Hoover blankets, which were literally just newspapers. This tragedy really peaked in the summer of 1932, when thousands of desperate World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, asking for their service bonuses a little early. The government responded with the Army firing tear gas and burning the camps of its own heroes. Americans watched this unfold in utter disbelief. But a psychological turning point finally arrived in March 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the podium for his inauguration and delivered that famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And honestly, it wasn't just a speech. It felt like the first collective deep breath the country had taken in years. And FDR didn't wait around. He immediately launched into action.
He rolled out what became known as his alphabet soup, the New Deal arsenal. He handed young men shovels through the CCC to plant trees and rebuild their pride. The WPA hired millions to build roads, bridges, and schools, finally getting people out of breadlines and onto scaffolding. But he also installed some crucial financial guardrails so a crash like this wouldn't happen again. He created the SEC to strictly regulate Wall Street and the FDIC to ensure bank deposits, which meant people could actually trust putting their hard-earned money in a bank vault again.
But perhaps just as importantly, the New Deal offered real emotional restoration. Social Security was established, which sent a super clear message to the elderly. You matter. We'll remember you. You won't have to work until you physically collapse. Even the arts were revived. The Federal Arts Project paid photographers like Dorothea Lange to document the nation's incredible survival. While Hollywood gave people a much-needed escape, packing theaters for The Wizard of Oz to watch a gray, dusty world turn back to vibrant color. America was beginning to dream again.
So, what's the ultimate takeaway here? What really pulled America completely out of this depression? Well, the New Deal absolutely stabilized the nation, but as the 1930s drew to a close, the factories began humming again for a totally different reason. They weren't just building consumer goods anymore, they were building helmets, boots, and ammunition. The economy fully reignited to prepare for a new, looming global nightmare, World War II. The Great Depression ended with a nation rising back to its feet, only to realize the whole world was about to catch fire. What happens when the cure for a total economic collapse is a global war? Think about that, and we'll see you next time.